This week on Personally Speaking, my guest is the actor John Rubenstein. John began as a Broadway star in Pippin and now is on the New York stage playing Dwight Eisenhower, President Eisenhower. Please stay with us. Hello and welcome to Personally Speaking. I'm your host, Msgr. Jim Lisante, and Tony Award-winning actor John Rubenstein joins me now. John originated the title role in the Broadway musical Pippin and won the Tony and Drama Desk Awards for his performance in Children of a Lesser God. His other Broadway appearances include Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Ragtime, and M. Butterfly. He starred in the TV series Family and Crazy Like a Fox, and films including Being the Ricardos, Hello, I Must Be Going, and The Boys from Brazil. John is starring in a new play in New York called Eisenhower, This Piece of Ground. He portrays the former president in this play, adapted from a vast array of General Eisenhower's memoirs, speeches, and letters, which is a candid and fascinating fictional eavesdropping on President Dwight D. Eisenhower at his Gettysburg, Pennsylvania farm. The play looks back on President Eisenhower's life, his Kansas upbringing, his decorated Army career, his victories in World War II, and his 2 terms as president as he contemplates the qualities and the adversities that make an American president great. Eisenhower, This Piece of Ground, has been extended by popular demand through August 20th. John is married to Bonnie Burgess, and their son Max is the youngest of his 5 children, joining Jessica, Michael, Peter, and Jacob. John's here with us today to talk about portraying President Eisenhower and the values that matter the most to him. Joining me now, I'm so pleased to welcome to Personally Speaking the iconic actor, John Rubenstein. John Rubenstein's our guest. He's in a wonderful play in New York about Dwight Eisenhower. Now, let me start by saying recently I had a kid in my parish who came into the rectory and he saw a picture of me with President Bush. He said, that's not President Bush, because he knew of George W., not the father. And I thought to myself, if this kid doesn't even know a recent Bush, he certainly doesn't know what Eisenhower. So for our listeners and watchers around the world, John, tell us, who is Dwight Eisenhower?
Well, Dwight Eisenhower was arguably the most powerful man of the 20th century. I mean, you can bring up names like Stalin, and you can bring up names like Hitler, and, people who made huge swaths of influence of both good and bad kinds around the world. But if you look at Eisenhower, he was a poor man from Kansas, who got into military school simply to get a free college education. That was the only reason. He had no interest in the military. And then he, after a long process, became the 5-star general, actually the last 5-star general that the American military has ever had. He ran the Second World War in Africa and Europe. President Roosevelt chose him to command the invasion of Europe that finally saved the world, one could argue, from Hitler. Came back to the United States, became president of Columbia University, one of the greatest universities in our country. Then he was the first commander of NATO. He created NATO, really. Got all those European countries together to try to work for peace instead of war. And then, reluctantly, again, having no interest to be a politician or to be president, finally became president of the United States for 2 terms. And all through that, he did amazing work in order to better the lives of the soldiers he commanded during the war, of the students he was president of at Columbia, of the European nations that he got together to form a union to fight, to prevent wars. And finally, for the citizens of the United States, from the far right to the far left, He made no distinctions.
Mm.
And he was the kind of politician that we very, very seldom see anymore in this
Right.
country or anywhere.
Yeah. John, he was a military hero. I know people know about that, but there were other military heroes. I'm thinking of Douglas MacArthur, who never were entrusted with leading our country like Eisenhower. What was it about the personality of the man that made Americans say he's a general, but he's a general we can see leading our civilian government?
Well, I think it was two things. I think it was he had a special talent for organization,
Mm.
so that when he was at West Point and later when he was in the Army, he was frustrated very often by the jobs they gave him. They weren't the big jobs to move you up the ranks, which is, the sort of the mentality, just like the mentality in the business world is to simply make more money.
Mm-hmm.
The mentality in the military is to be promoted, to get a higher rank. He never got those jobs, and he was sometimes angry and felt passed over. But in each job that he did, his MO was to do the best job he could, whatever the job. That isn't the main mentality of either the military or the business world. It's to get ahead. It's to get more for me. And he didn't feel that way. He said,
Mm-hmm.
do the job I've been assigned and do it the best possible way. So that when finally it came to those bigger appointments,
Mm-hmm.
President Roosevelt looked at George Patton and at, MacArthur and others, great generals who were sort of stars in their way, and passed them over and went right to Eisenhower because he was renowned for being able to not only get a job done with proper organization, but to do it the best he possibly could, not for selfish reasons, but for the job itself and for the people involved. And I think that's what made him stand out.
John Rubenstein is our guest, who's playing Dwight Eisenhower in New York. Unusually for any actor, I would imagine, is that you had the privilege when you were a 9-year-old of meeting President Eisenhower. But many years later, how did the part come to you?
Well, it was, by hook and crook. We actors, are most of us are just journeymen.
Yeah.
We go from job to job. We hope to ever work again every time one of our jobs ends. And our jobs end. A play closes, a movie finishes shooting, a television series is done. And you're constantly out of work and saying, gosh, I hope I ever work again.
Yeah.
So here I am sitting around at home post-COVID, looking for stuff to do. And I'm doing some television and doing some theater. And suddenly my email, there is a play about Eisenhower, a one-man play. And I read it. It's 40 pages of single-spaced monologue. And I said, oh, my gosh.
Wow.
Who's going to come and see this? And B, how can I make this interesting? What can I do with this? Yeah. And I was rather negative about it. Then the director and the writer asked me to come and just meet with the two of them, or just the three of us, and read it out loud. They had never heard it read. And they'd been working on it. The writer had written it, and the director and he had been working on it, but they hadn't heard it out loud. So I listened to a bunch of tapes of Eisenhower, and I sort of got his sound, not an actual, mimic of exactly how he sounded, but that sort of authoritative way he talked. And he talked like this.
Yeah.
He was from the Midwest, and he was used to being in charge. So he had a sort of authoritative way of saying what he wanted to say. But he also spoke in a very, we would call it maybe folksy way, a sort of very, very American country kind of way, not pretentious. And so I got that sound sort of in my ears, and I went and met them for the first time. No, I knew the director from before, but we hadn't actually worked together.
Right.
And I read it out loud. And by the time I was finished, the three of us sort of looked at each other across this table and said, we've got to do this play. Because what didn't jump off the page to me as I just read it absolutely did when I spoke it, when I was Eisenhower for those
Right.
few, for those couple of hours. There was so much in it, uh, and that's what our audiences are getting now. And it's remarkable how they sit silently and take it all in, and then at the end they sort of explode with enthusiasm and with emotion because it's an emotional story.
Now, when you just mentioned a few moments ago the life of an actor and being a journeyman, the instability in some ways of traveling, taking what comes here and there, you reminded me that back maybe around 2003, I was doing a TV show for something called The Christophers, and one of my guests was, in fact, one of your five children, Mike Weston. And I wondered to myself,
Oh,
when you've been in the businesses you have, were you encouraging of your children to go into the arts, and knowing that it was an up and down kind of world, that you warn your children against it?
no. I mean, I didn't encourage them and I didn't discourage them at all.
Ah,
I just backed away a little bit and watched what was their enthusiasm, where they found inspiration and joy and ambition even to pursue something. And they all sort of chose their own path. And Mike was a wonderful athlete. All I have five kids, and most of them were terrific athletes. Not that I was; they just fell into it. And one of the great joys of my parenthood was going to games, as
right,
it
right.
is with many.
Yeah.
Mike was a very good soccer player, but he was a sort of extra talented baseball player. And he had a powerful arm. He played shortstop. There was nothing that got by him. He played outfield, and he could nail a runner from deep center field and get him out at the plate with his arm. So when he got into high school, because he had that good arm, they forgot about shortstop and outfield, which were his two really best positions. And they made him pitch, because that's what you need. You need a pitcher who can throw. So he threw, and he threw very hard, and he won a lot of games, and they made him pitch and pitch and pitch and pitch and pitch. Nobody ever really took care of any, like they do now with pitchers. Oh, we're counting the pitches. He's pitched 87 pitches. He's got to sit down. None of that. And he wrecked his shoulder. He got, by the time he was in 10th grade, he could barely lift his arm.
Wow.
So he just, by chance, joined the drama group there in high school and started doing plays. And I would go, of course, just as I went to his baseball and soccer games, I went to his plays. And by gum, there he was. He knew what he was doing. He had a tremendous look about him, about a ferocity, yes, and ability to tap into his emotions, which were and remain very, very seething. He's an emotional person, and he was able to channel that into his work as an actor. And he has a great sense of humor. So so he became an actor, and I, of course, I've had conversations with him where both of us, I said, "Well, how did your audition go?" "I didn't get the darn part." "And how'd yours go, Dad?" "Yeah, they're not interested in me." And we commiserate together. And yeah, sure, I have said, and I will always say to anybody, don't pick up acting if it's not the main focus of your life, because it's too hard. It's just too hard. Insecure. You spend your entire life living in insecurity. And some people like me, I would prefer that. And when I am working, when I'm lucky enough to have a job, it's something that I love to do, and I can't wait to get to work, rather than have security and have my annual salary all set up and my budget all prepared. And every day I get up to go to work and I say, "Oh God, here we go again." That's what I have avoided in my life, and I feel very fortunate.
You're reminding me the way you talk about Michael and probably all your children. We had an interview years ago with Tim Russett, and I said, "Your greatest accomplishment?" He said, "I made all of Luke's games." His son, his son was so important to him, just like Michael is for you. Now, let me ask you too. Let's go back a bit to the experience of you in terms of how you were encouraged to go into the arts. This is a question not related to the arts so much as to the people who formed and shaped you, the mom and dad who did right by you. Um, Now it's not unusual because I do it almost every weekend while I'm married couples on Long Island who are both Catholic and Jewish. But I was surprised to read up that your mom was Catholic, dad was Jewish in the 1940s. That had to be a huge thing to do. Did they ever tell you like how they managed it? I'm sure back then that particular joining of faiths was a big deal.
Well, I have to tell you, um, in Poland, they're both Polish. They were both Polish. There was then, and there was before they showed up, and there is still very much today, a tremendous anti-Semitism.
Yeah, yeah.
Even to the degree where people in Poland, if you're Catholic, you're called a Pole. If you're Jewish, you're called a Jew.
Yeah.
You're not called a Pole. You're a Jew, even though you're just as Polish as the Catholic Pole standing next to you.
Yeah.
So my parents, yeah, my mother was Catholic. She was born in a Catholic family. I remember her mother, my grandmother, was the only grandparent of the four that I knew because they were all deceased before I was born. And she did her little rosary every day and she showed it to me. And I went to church with her a couple of times and thought it was really nice. But my mother, her daughter, basically had no need for religion of any sort.
Okay.
And my father, who was a very proud Jew, had no use or respect for religion of any sort, including the Jewish one.
Okay.
So they both saw how, and I say this with all due respect and a little sheepishness to you, how religion has so deeply, deeply wounded the world since ancient times. And that's all religions, all of them. We didn't practice any religion. I went to church with my grandma just to be with her, not to,
right.
She wasn't indoctrinating me. She just liked to go to church every Sunday. And she was an old lady and I went with her because I loved her. And I enjoyed it too, the singing and all that. And I went to Protestant schools that weren't religious schools at all. But we did, we said prayers and we sang hymns and we did all that stuff. But, with my Jewish last name, I always get people around September coming up to me with a wink and saying, Happy New Year, John. Yeah. And I go, what? Oh, of course. Yes, of course. Yes. Thank you so much. Happy New Year to you too. We never did any bar mitzvahs. We never did any temples. We never did any churches. We never did anything. And that's how I grew up. And that's clearly what I believe.
I'm thinking, I don't disagree with everything. That's for sure. Like when I say to people, what was your background? They say, well, I'm not religious. I'm spiritual. And I think to myself, but isn't the purpose of religion to connect us to the spiritual? And clearly, sometimes it becomes nothing more than a cultural force and not a spiritual force. So, and you're right. I just said today in a mass I did that I'm horrified that there was a attack by one Muslim group in Pakistan on another Muslim group, both professing they believe in God and killing in the name of God. And as you're right. Every religion has done it. Even for a long time, Richard Thomas, we were talking, because he's a Buddhist. He was just so appalled that recently in Southeast Asia, Buddhists are killing Muslims. And you would have hoped the Buddhists would be the one group that are truly embracing the notion of peace. But I would correct one thing, John. I hope you're wrong. I hope you're wrong. A good Jewish friend of mine, Jill, said to me at a funeral recently, what you say about life beyond this life is so comforting. And I said, I don't say it because it's comforting, although it is. I say it because I really believe it. I do believe in a life to come. But on many of the things you said, John, we're not far afield, that's for sure. Now let's get back to our friend Dwight Eisenhower. Did he have a religious background?
Well, his, as is delineated in the play, his mother was deeply religious.
Okay.
Those are the two words that he used and that I say in the play. She was a Jehovah's Witness.
Oh, okay.
And he says about her that she was the most sincere pacifist he ever knew. And her deepest belief was a complete rejection of the use of force in any kind of human affairs.
Amazing.
But she never tried to push her beliefs on anybody else.
Okay.
So he was never raised in any particular church.
Uh-huh.
But we don't get into religion in the play very much, but I do believe that he was somebody who would mention the word God and believe that he was talking about something that he felt serious and deeply about.
John Rubenstein's our guest, the great actor. John, I said I would mention again, I went when you were in Pippin, saw you in Pippin 50 years ago. That was hard to believe.
You must have been about 3.
Thank you. I was born in Ike's first term, 1952, so I'm just a little bit behind you. But I remember thinking to myself, even then, God, this thing of doing a show every night must be exhausting. Now, here we are, 50 years later, and you're still hitting the boards. Where do you find the energy, the devotion to do the same thing over and over again and still make it for that kid in the front row who's never been to a play before, fresh and alive? I've done it a million times before, but tonight I'm going to find the energy, the dynamism to make it happen again. Where does that come from, John?
Well, I don't know, really. I mean, it's just I'm sure that you and your job have some similar obstacles to hurdle, of I got to give them another speech today and try to lift their spirits and give them something to go home with and make them feel better. I don't know where you come up with it all the time, because if I had to do that, I would be giving them some pretty dark sermons to limp home with. So yeah, my brother-in-law for a long time was William Sloane Coffin Jr. I don't know if you were aware of him. He was a great
anti-war guy. Yeah.
He was a chaplain at Andover for the prep school. He was a chaplain of Yale, of Williams College, and of Yale University. And yes, he was, along with Dr. Jonas Salk and all those guys who were protesting the Vietnam War, and he rode the freedom buses down in Selma and all those things. He was a great, great man of religion. And I used to go to his sermons because he was so impassioned and he was so inspiring. And he talked about God, of course. He had to. That's part of the job description.
Yes, it is.
But he mostly talked about people and their lives, and it didn't have to do with you had to make sure to say these words and to do these moves and to ascribe to any kind of performative behaviors. You just had to listen and get it right somehow.
Yeah.
And sure, he was a man of God, whatever that means, and that was his profession. But boy, he was inspiring.
Yeah. And you're saying you try to bring the same dynamism to what you do each time?
Yeah, but it came from him. It wasn't something that he worked on manufacturing or impersonating. He was like that if you were just sitting with him in a room over a cup of coffee.
Wow.
And my father was a great musician, and he was like that too. He was just full of fire, not anger, but just love of life and ferocious anger when it was to him appropriate, and tremendous joy and rapture when that was appropriate. And I feel I just sort of inherited that kind of thing. Energy is never a problem for me. It never has been.
Even right now, John, you're coming through the screen with that energy. You're
wonderful. There it is.
Yeah.
That's the kind of person I am. And I've seen many people in my life say, "Hey, John, simmer down. Will you back off? We got the point." You don't
right.
For the 14th time. Yeah.
Last Eisenhower question, because this is one that's always kind of stuck in my head, John. I remember being impressed as a teenager when I saw the video of his talk on the military-industrial complex. Here's this military guy made his fame because of his background in military, and yet he's calling the military on the fact that they've sold their soul in so many cases to the businessmen. And he's right, and it continues to go on. It's even worse than ever now. But any sense of what's the heart of the integrity of the man to say, I know this world, and because I know this world, I can call them on the times when they're doing something that is simply wrong?
You mean what led him to have that sort of
where did it come from
about right and wrong in
Yeah.
general? I think it was about both his parents. Okay. His father was a strict disciplinarian, and he talks about him in that way. He was frightening. He punished him. He hit him. You know, he made sure that he did what he was supposed to do, and he got in trouble if he didn't. And his mother was the opposite. Yeah. She felt, yes, you ought to behave properly, but because it was the right thing to do, not because you were afraid of some kind of, punishment if you didn't. And I think he managed to blend those two approaches to life, sort of took the best of each of them and realized how important discipline and abiding by certain rules and not breaking them, how important that was, and also how important it was to be human, to understand that people have hearts and minds and emotions, and you can't just always put them in a box and make them do A, B, C, but never D, or you're in trouble. They'll do D sometimes, and you'll have to help them with it and figure it out. And I think that kind of that combination of empathy and strict adherence to what was right and what was the rules was a great mixture for him, and that allowed him to be the man that he was.
I want to thank John Rubenstein for being with us. I've been a huge fan for years. I was the Children of Lesser God and Pippin, so I'm showing my age. But you're just a great actor, and I thank you so much. And I hope Eisenhower will go on and on, because he is precisely the kind of a political figure, historical figure that I think people need to know more about. And it troubles me that there are people out there who have no clue who he is or what he stood for. And I'm glad that you're revealing him by using your craft to do that. And John, you're such a refreshing. I'm so used to guests doing this for 30 years who have canned answers to everything, and I love. You are wonderfully spontaneous.
Well, I overstep some of the polite boundaries.
But I find that refreshing. I do, and I thank you for your honesty.
It's a thing worth discussing.
Yeah. All that. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
As we end today's program, if you'd like to reach out to me for any reason, you can get me at personallyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com. Aside from listening to us on SiriusXM, the Catholic channel, you can also watch us on YouTube by going to Personally Speaking with Msgr Jim Lisante. Please hit like and subscribe. We're also, as you probably know, on Facebook at Personally Speaking with Msgr Jim Lisante, and now we're also on Instagram at Personally Speaking Podcast. I'm privileged to serve as host and executive producer of Personally Speaking. We'll be with you again next time on Personally Speaking.